Tonight, I can't think of a more wonderful title than the one which our guest speaker has chosen. What's happening in the South China Sea? American interests and Chinese behavior. It's filled with mysteries, and it's with us every day. The events are with us constantly, but it's part of a larger strategy which interests all of us. And clearly our relations with the People's Republic of China is one of the key things to the dignity of the future. Our guest, if you're going to select one person in the United States to have talk on this subject, it would probably be him. No one is better steeped in this particular issue than him. Let me mention just a little bit about his background. He's a graduate of Southern Cal. He master's degree from Georgetown in U.S. diplomatic history in East Asia. And he is a graduate of the National War College, and he also was at the Naval War College for a year as part of the CNO's strategic study group. His military service, 34 years, has focused on the Pacific to a great extent. 2 years stationed in Japan. He had 4 operational commands, including of an aircraft carrier battle group. He served during the time of the H.W. Bush administration as a director of East Asia policy in the Defense Department. And he also has a stint with CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, working on, again, planning war plans and policy. So his military career is an impressive one, and it does have a focus upon East Asia. He has been, for the last 15 years, at the Center for Naval Analysis in Washington. He served as vice president in charge of strategic studies, I believe, for a number of years. He's now a senior research fellow at the Institute. He's headed a couple of interesting projects. One is the strategic interests of the littoral, stretching from the Arabian Sea through the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea and East China Sea and then the Sea of Japan. Interesting study. He also heads a project which is a dialogue with the major maritime research organizations in Asia. And for the last 2.5 years, he's been focusing on the South China Sea. When you hear people talk about someone they've heard in the South China Sea and it's him, they're delighted. His reputation is wonderful for his presentations. In any case, that's what he's been looking at hard. He's interested and has studied and published on the maritime interests of China within their strategic efforts. It's an enormous pleasure and quite an honor to present Admiral McDevitt.
Thank you, Frank, for that very generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be here in Baltimore. My wife and I came a little bit earlier today and had a chance to walk around the beautiful harbor district here. I'm ashamed to say, all of our previous trips to Baltimore were to watch the Orioles play. Not ashamed to say that watching the Orioles, but we never got any further into it than this. But as Frank said, for the last 3 years or so, I've been working on foundation grants that I was able to receive to look at policy options in the South China Sea. And there's a certain irony in that, because between 1964 and 1970, my first years in the Navy, I spent an inordinate amount of time sailing in the South China Sea because of the Vietnam War, up and down the coast, all the way from the Tonkin Gulf down to the southern reaches of Vietnam on 4 different ships. And I crisscrossed that body of water innumerable times. And it was, if you would have told me 50 years later I was going to be doing policy options because of China's activities in the South China Sea, I would have said, you got to be kidding me. Tonight we're going to be participating in a bit of an experiment for me, because This is the sort of topic that is best to be able to project maps, but because of the configuration of the room, it was decided that it would be better to provide paper copies. And I saw all of you looking through your paper copies of maps and what have you, and let me tell you how I hope this will work. I will cue you to go to map number such and such, and then I'll talk a little bit about that. And obviously these were printed in color, or they're color view graphs, but they're printed in black and white. But if there's any question anybody has, I think I'll be able to talk to you. But the basic purpose of being able to talk about or present the maps is this is an incredibly difficult topic to talk about without being able to visualize it. So before we go on to the map business, let me provide a strategic context, if you will, an overview of what's going on more broadly in Asia. There's a competition going on between China and the United States and East Asia over who is going to be at the strategic center of the East Asian order. China's reemergence as I emphasize reemergence as China's most powerful state means that it wants to reclaim something of its historic centrality in East Asia. The problem for China is that the United States is already sitting in that spot. And the United States has indicated that it has every intention to remain an East Asian power. Therefore, the strategic challenge for China is how to shift the U.S. off of the center, being the center of the East Asia strategy equation, and take over that space, but do that without precipitating a war. Neither China nor the United States is looking for a fight. And for Washington, of course, the challenge is how to accommodate China's rise and China's power, which is very real, while reassuring its friends and allies that it intends to remain engaged in Asia and remain to try to hold on to its strategic centrality. So this competition is going on. Well, I predict it will be going on for many, many years, perhaps many decades. But today, the South China Sea is where that competition is playing out. Even though the South China Sea is not the most important issue between the United States and China, issues like North Korea, global warming, economic relations, and what have you, are far more important generally in the overall context of the U.S.-China relation than the South China Sea. But nonetheless, this is actually where it's playing out. So with this preamble, turn to map number 1, please. Okay, now this is another context map. I do this not to insult your intelligence, but I wanted everybody to see the Pacific Ocean, because when you went to high school, if your high school maps that you looked at were the same as my high school maps, what you saw was the Atlantic Ocean in the middle, the United States on one side, Europe on the other, and half the Pacific over here, and half the Pacific over here. It was really rare to ever see a Pacific-centered map. And in fact, if you look closely at this, you can see this is fairly old. It was hard to find this on the internet. But, so that's the first reason I'm showing you this. The second reason is to orient you to where the South China Sea is in relationship to Asia. Now, if you look on the far left of the map over here, and if you squint your eyes, you can see the Philippines, and on the other coast, Vietnam, and the South China Sea is right between the Philippines and Vietnam. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But that's where it is in Asia. It's bounded on the east by the Philippines, on the south by Malaysia and Indonesia, on the west by Vietnam, in the north by China and Hainan. And I know there's a lady in the audience somewhere who told me she just came back from 3 months in Hainan. So if you have any detailed questions about Hainan, she's right there. So now let's go to map 2. Now, this is a bigger picture of the South China Sea, and you can see circles around 3 island groups. In the northern part of the South China Sea are the Paracel Island group up to the north. And then kind of in the middle, near the Philippines, is Scarborough Shoal. And I'll be talking about all of these shortly. And then down at the bottom where there's a whole bunch of dots inside that circle, or the bottom of the map, that's the Spratly Island group. There are there's hundreds of rocks and shoals in that area. On most navigation charts, I can remember when I was a navigator on a destroyer sailing back and forth across there, the words on the chart say dangerous ground. In other words, do not sail in there, because most of the islands, like Spratly, you know how they got those names? Those were the names of ships that ran aground there. No, I'm not making that up. And so it is very hazardous. With the introduction of global positioning navigation, it's a lot easier to find your way around there. But back in the day, before you had GPS and you had to depend upon either Lorian or celestial navigation, it was a very hazardous area to go in there. There's about 140 features in that island chain, in the Spratly Island chain, that are above water 24 hours a day. Now, why is that important? If you're above water 24 hours a day, even if you're only as big as my arm, you rate a 12-mile territorial sea around that piece of land if you can claim sovereignty over it. So not only do you have sovereignty over the little bitty rock, if it's above water 24 hours a day, but you have 12 miles of territorial sea, which means all of the fish and resources, oil, gas, whatever it is, are yours and nobody else's. So that's up in the Paracel Island group, up to the north. China took half of those by force from the South Vietnamese in 1974, right at the end of the Vietnam War. The United States government turned a blind eye when the South Vietnamese asked for help and said, can you send the 7th Fleet? We didn't. When Secretary of State Kissinger was asked to support the South Vietnamese in the UN, we didn't. In other words, we didn't care at the time that the Chinese ran the South Vietnamese off those islands. But so the Paracel Island group has been China's in toto since 1974. The Vietnamese still claim it, but they're never going to get them back. So let me go to map 3, because that's another map of the South China Sea in a little more detail. And the main reason I put this in there is because I highlighted the latitude line of 12 degrees north, running right through the South China Sea there. Every piece of land above 12 degrees north is already under Chinese control. All of the islands and features, and it has been the Spratlys, as I said, for over 40 years now, or close to 50 years. Pratus Reef, way at the top, is actually is being occupied by Taiwan, the Republic of China. But since the People's Republic of China is the legal successor state to the former Republic of China, the reason Taiwan Coast Guard is sitting on those islands is only at the sufferance of the mainland. For broader reasons we can talk about during a Q&A if you like. So the only remaining disputed area are in the Spratly Island, and I'll get to that right now. China claims every bit of land in the South China Sea and said, we have, for centuries, this has been Chinese territory. And all we're trying to do is take what belongs to us back from the Vietnamese, who were sitting on about 25 of the Spratly Islands. They moved in the mid-70s and occupy and have over the past over 10 years from 74 to 84, 85, occupied about 25 of those features. and they've put people on them. Oh, by the way, there are no expatriates, Spratlians. There are no people who lived on the island. And so the only people who are there today are folks who have been asked by their country to go squat in these godforsaken places. And so the Vietnamese have occupied that many. The Philippines, which claims part of the Spratly Islands, sits on about 7 or 8. The Malaysians only claim what they're sitting on, which are 7 or 8. So what you have to review the bidding here is China claims everything. Taiwan, like China, because China's claim came from the Republic of China. Taiwan claims everything. Vietnam claims the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands. The Philippines claim some of the Spratly Islands and that little place called Scarborough Shoal. And the Malaysians claim the small number of features that they're on. So, by claiming that, I'm saying that they say we have sovereignty, which means that they get, as a minimum, get that 12 miles. In many ways, the most important resource that people are looking for are the fish, because all of the countries that border the South China Sea have fished in the South China Sea for millennia. I mean, as long ago as there were fishermen, they fished there. But China, in particular, is a tremendous consumer of fish. They consume about 50% of the entire amount of fish in the world that is caught or raised in agriculture. They consume. And as they become more wealthy, they want more protein in their diet. And so the demand signal from Beijing is to increase their fishing capability to harvest more fish, because China is, one, interested in food security. And instead of having to import grain, as they have from places like Argentina and what have you, they want to be able to catch their own. So not only are the Chinese interested in exploiting all of the fish they can in the South China Sea, they are out globally around the world and off the coast of Africa, off the coast of South America, and what have you, fishing. The Chinese think there's lots of oil and gas under the bottom of the South China Sea. The U.S. has an organization that was started by President Carter during the oil crisis of 78 or 79, whatever it was, called the Energy Information Agency, EIA. And if you Google EIA, you can find out lots of really interesting stuff. And one of the interesting things you can find out is, in their estimate, most of the gas and oil, if there is any in the South China Sea, lies on the coastal shelf of the Philippines and Vietnam, and hardly any of it lies in the middle where all these islands are. Chinese don't believe that. They think there's a lot there. And from their point of view, instead of having to bring oil all the way from the Persian Gulf, if you had it really next door, that would be a huge strategic advantage. So that's another reason why they're interested in control. They also have historic reasons, and many people argue the historic reason is even more important than anything else. When the British and then the French came and essentially in the Opium War, the British invaded China, opened the door, coerced them into accepting unequal treaties, starting what the Chinese called the century of humiliation. How did these people come? They came from the sea. How? Up through the south, in the case of the British and French, across the Indian Ocean, from India all the way up into the South China Sea, and that's how they got to expanded their control from Canton all the way up into China. So there's historic reasons why the Chinese say we have security interests here too. We've been invaded before from people who come via the South China Sea, and therefore we think it's important that we have control so that doesn't happen again. So that's another historic slant strategic argument they can make with regard to that. And then finally, Hainan Island, I mentioned. There is a major Chinese naval base at Sanya, at the southern tip of Hainan Island. And guess what? That's where they have their SSBNs, their ballistic missile nuclear-powered submarines that are just starting deterrent patrols out in the Pacific. And so they're very worried about the United States doing what we did to the Soviets, which is following them. And so that's another strategic reason why they care about the South China Sea. Okay, can I get you to turn to map 4? This one is interesting because it shows the centrality of the South China Sea as a major thoroughfare for shipping, for commerce, sea line of communication. All of the oil and raw materials that come to East Asia, not just China, but also to Japan, to South Korea, et cetera, comes across, at least the petroleum, comes across the Indian Ocean through the Straits of Malacca. So if you look there, there's a little bitty circle right there, right underneath the M in Malaysia. That's a choke point, but that area, that body of water is called the Strait of Malacca or Straits of Malacca. And that's where all of this traffic goes through. And it travels across the South China Sea to China, to Japan, to South Korea, as I said. And also, of course, Chinese and Japanese and South Korean exports going to Europe or going to India or East Africa also travel that way, except in reverse. They go via the South China Sea. They go that way because it's the most convenient way. It's not the only way. When you read press reports, you get the impression that if somebody put a cork on either end of the South China Sea, commercial traffic would stop. That's not true. It's the most convenient, the most cost-efficient way. But if you look at some of those other arrows there, you can see that it's possible to get to Northeast Asia bypassing the South China Sea altogether. It would just be a longer route. Have to put more shipping into the chain, if you will, so that you could have the same delivery time and what have you. But that's the reality is the South China Sea, because it is the most convenient and cost-efficient way, it gets a huge amount of commercial traffic. And since so much of that is Chinese, the Chinese have not, we need to be upfront about it, the Chinese have not interfered at all with any commercial traffic in the South China Sea, ever. So, one of the biggest problems in the South China Sea is what a lot of people call the 9-dash line. And I'm going to ask you to go to map, well, it's on 3, but if you go to map 11, you can see it more easily. I'm sorry, map 5, I'm sorry. I had a little note on there, map 5. If you look at map 5, you can see those bold lines that kind of outline the South China Sea. If you count them, there should be 9. And those are something they inherited from Taiwan, that the mainland inherited from Taiwan. And China refuses to exactly say what they mean, deliberately, because we think they have an idea what they mean. But because those lines, see how close they come to the Philippines and Vietnamese? Well, you have to imagine 200 miles out from the coast of the Philippines or 200 miles out from the coast of Vietnam. That's something called the exclusive economic zone. It's a new formulation that came in with the law of the sea, the UNCLOS Treaty of 1992. It says essentially that the coastal state has partial, not entire, not complete, partial sovereignty from its coastline all the way 200 miles out. So if you were to sail out from Baltimore here and go out in the Atlantic, for 200 miles, the United States has partial sovereignty. Partial sovereignty over what? All the fish and gas and everything else is ours and nobody else's. It's because we're the coastal state. Well, the problem with the 9-dash line is it goes right through that exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, of the Vietnamese and the Filipinos and the Malaysians. And the Chinese, while I haven't said this, are acting like they own all the resources inside the 9-dash line. Well, that means, in effect, they're trying to hijack the resources that legitimately and legally, by the law of the sea, belong to the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia and to the coastal states. So this is a big deal, because the Philippine economy, for example, is pretty poor, not doing too well. And if they could exploit the oil resources that they have on their continental shelf that they know about, it would be a huge economic boost. But every time they try to hire a survey outfit from another, an international company, the Chinese Coast Guard or the Chinese fishing, maritime militia come in and harass them, cut their cables, and then so nobody will do business. And so this is one reason why the Philippines have taken China to court. In fact, probably the main reason. So I've covered the EEZ. So I've already covered what China wants. They want it all. And hi, Robbie. And they're not doing this frivolously. They, in their heart of hearts, believe it belongs to them. And so this is not some fictitious thing that they're doing just because the party said to do it. They, Chinese citizens believe the South China Sea is theirs. After all, why would you call it the South China Sea? And so that puts a lot of pressure on the party, because if they show any weaknesses, the netizens, the people who are commenting and what have you, can start lambasting him. And so, believe it or not, the Chinese Communist Party, it too is worried about public opinion. Now, it is also very good at cracking heads too, but nonetheless, it worries about public opinion and the credibility of the party. And of course, that's what Xi Jinping is all about, which is trying to clean the corruption out of the party. But because they believe it's theirs, they've been embarked on this long-term project, as I call it, of slowly but surely grabbing all of the land features. And as I said, they've taken the paracels from the Vietnamese. They took Scarborough Shoal from the Filipinos in 2012 after a deal that the U.S. government brokered with the Chinese went sour. And they consider the Vietnamese and the Filipinos and the Malaysians who are sitting on these features as squatters. And there's public pressure in China. Why are you tolerating this? Why don't you evict these people? And so, and what they also want is, as a minimum, what they call their historic rights to all of the resources inside that 9-dash line I just talked about. And of course, it wants to have that strategic buffer I explained to you to prevent somebody else. Their argument is, one of their arguments is, well, if we don't have the Spratlys, somebody who might want to cut our sea lanes might take them. Now, it doesn't help that a lot of commentators around the world, including in the United States, say, gee, the best way to bring China to its knees in case of a conflict is to cut their sea lanes. I mean, they can read too. And so the Chinese are well aware that lots of people are speculating about how you could really, in case of a conflict with China, how you could take advantage of their vulnerability at sea. And so that's another reason why they figure if they own them, nobody else can do that. So, what are U.S. interests in all this? Why should we care? We don't have a claim to any of those pieces of dirt in the South China Sea. Well, it's a combination of, not a combination, it largely revolves around the argument that I presented to you at the beginning. We see ourselves as at the center of the strategic life of East Asia, and we believe that our military presence and the fact that we're engaged in Asia has brought stability and wealth and economic growth for all of Asia since the end of the Vietnam War. And that this is the formula for success. And one of the key elements of that formula is everybody follows the rules. Everybody listens and pays attention to what international law prescribes and requires. And so that's our primary interest. Is we essentially, in the Obama administration, announced something called the Rebalance Strategy. First the pivot, and they changed the name to the Rebalance Strategy, which essentially said we're going to put more resources away from the Middle East and rebalance to our more traditional posture in Asia. More of the Navy's going to the Pacific Fleet. More of the Air Force is going to be in the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. So Chinese see that as containment. We see that as stability. And so the administration is worried that if China continues to do what some people have called salami slicing, taking small incremental steps, none of which are serious enough to raise the threshold to actual combat, but effectively change the reality on the ground or in the water, as it were, that if this keeps on going, our friends and allies in the region are going to say, well, the Americans are nothing more than a paper tiger. The Chinese already tell them that. And so part of it is our vision of ourselves is why we care. But we also have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, signed way back in 1951. Now, this treaty doesn't say that automatically we would go to war, but it says it is a mutual defense treaty, and President Obama and the Secretary of Defense have both said our defense commitment to the Philippines is rock solid. That's the word he used. Now, the Philippines can't defend themselves at all. Their military right now is in really sad shape. The Army shouldn't say it, the Army has been fighting Islamic terrorism down in the southern Philippines for decades. And so they aren't bad, but the Navy and the Air Force are woeful pitiful. And so we worry that the treaty doesn't say that it covers Philippine claims in the Spratlys because, quite frankly, some of those are pretty legally suspect. But if a Philippine ship is sunk, a Philippine Navy ship or Coast Guard ship is sunk, or a Philippine airplane is shot down, or Philippine soldiers, sailor, or airmen are killed by the Chinese, that would make the treaty applicable. And so the potential, not high, but the potential is there that because of our mutual defense treaty, we could wind up into some sort of, at least perhaps a limited conflict with China over something that happened to the Filipinos. So that's an interest. And the other interest is the United States, despite not ratifying the treaty, has been assiduous in paying attention to the particulars of what is required to comply with all aspects of the law of the sea treaty. And the United States believes that the best way to resolve these issues is through peaceful deliberations, dialogue, agreements to mutual resource sharing, and what have you, all things that are spelled out in the law of the sea as ways to adjudicate or to resolve differences like we see in the South China Sea. And then we think it's really important to be very strict in our interpretation of what we call high seas freedoms. You often hear it referred to as freedom of navigation. As I said, the Chinese have not interrupted commercial traffic, but what the Chinese do require, because of their domestic law, not the law of the sea, is, in theory, every time a U.S. airplane or ship travels their EEZ, we have to get their permission. Well, the truth of the matter is the law of the sea says that's not so. Now, we routinely ignore this. But nonetheless, the Chinese are trying to argue that their domestic law trumps the international treaty law of the sea. And so that's another interest that we have. And so our policy, diplomatic policy, the things that we have specifically stated, these are our policy points, are pretty straightforward. Unimpeded, lawful commerce and freedom of navigation. Military operations in China's EEZ are permissible. We take no position on whose sovereignty claim is the better. So we stay really out of that fight. Not saying China's claim is better or Vietnam's claim is better or Philippines' claim is better. The truth of the matter is one of the studies that I did, I commissioned papers from respected international lawyers, and it turns out that probably the claims of Vietnam and China to the Spratly Islands are so close that it would depend upon how an international tribunal elected to weigh certain bits of historic evidence to decide which way it would go, one way or the other. Colloquially, it's a crapshoot if you went to court with this. We want peaceful resolution, no coercion, no threats or intimidation. We think the claimants should publicly clarify their claims. This is our code word for telling China to explain exactly what they think the 9-dash line means, and to work collaboratively to resolve disputes and develop a substantive code of conduct amongst all of the coastal states. China said they would do this, but they've been dragging their feet for the last 12 years to conclude the code of conduct so that everybody understood what the rules of the game were. So the latest thing that has gotten all of the headlines, and I'm getting close to the end here, is that China has, if you turn to map 11, or maybe you're already there at map 11, you can see those map 11 has, I'm sorry, map 5. See, I have 11 written up in the corner here. Anyway, map 5. That was just a quiz, seeing if you're paying attention. That's, those 7 features that are highlighted there, those are the rocks and low tide elevations that China occupied in 1988. After everybody else beat them to the best real estate. The Vietnamese beat them to the best, and the Filipinos, they occupied all of the things that actually look like an island. What China was left with was 3 little rocks poking above water at high tide, and then 4 low tide elevation. Low tide elevation is something that's only above water at low tide, but when the tide comes in, it's underwater. And they built, 20 years ago, built small outposts on them, just like all of the other countries had done, so that they're, as I say, these poor PLA soldiers or sailors or whoever they were, Marines, that they sent down there had some kind of a quality of life. Well, what happened was in 2014, they started changing that dramatically by dredging, and that's what I wanted to show in map or picture 6 and 7. Mischief Reef, you can find it on this one on this map 5. You can see Mischief Reef right there. It's close to the Philippines. That's what it looked like in 1995 when they started building, quote, shelters for the fishermen. Now here's a satellite picture of it taken last year, and those shelters and then turned into a platform. That's the spot down at the bottom. All of this is landfill. And what kind of land is that? That's busted up coral. So they've been destroying coral, and a huge ecological disaster, quite frankly. And how are they doing it at map 8? All these ships with the little, looks like they have tails going to the beach, those are dredges, and those are actually flexible pipelines, and they're sucking stuff off the bottom and depositing the sand and the coral to build up the reef. And they've done that on the 7 features that they controlled. 3 of them are going to have 10,000-foot runways on them that you can employ fighter aircraft on. And so this is a massive change of the strategic balance in the Spratly Islands. And so that's why the United States is so concerned, is they have really changed the balance of power in a dramatic sort of a way, in a coercive sort of a way. Remember, I said this is part of their project. Eventually they want to get the Vietnamese and the Philippines to pull up stakes and leave. Well, they're putting in place these mini bases that have small harbors where you can put small frigates or Coast Guard cutters, airfields, barracks, and what have you, in which you could put soldiers and et cetera, et cetera. They have the ability now to militarily dominate all of their neighbors in the Spratly Islands. And so that's what changed our policy and put more of a military bent to it. The latest formulation of our policy, which I think is a terrific way to say it, is the United States will sail or fly wherever international law permits, full stop. And so if that means going by one of these features, if it's within, if it's our interpretation of whether it rates any maritime entitlements or not, that's too bad. So that's where we are right now. We have on patrol in the South China Sea probably 2 destroyers 365 days a year. Wherever they go, the PLA Navy's following them. They have very civilized exchanges on the radio and what have you. We're doing lots of exercise. There's an exercise going on right now as we speak with the Philippines to help build up their capacity and what have you. So the military piece of this is starting to generate a little momentum. As I said, nobody's looking for a fight, but by the same token, the U.S. does not want to see China succeed in its aim by forcibly or intimidating all of the other occupants and running them off of those islands. So the bottom line is, what can the U.S. do about this? And I'm sorry to say the answer is not too much. We can rhetorically castigate the Chinese for doing what they're doing and saying that they should be following the rules, et cetera, but unless you're willing to use force, because quite frankly, China has been ignoring us and been ignoring everybody else who's been screaming about this. Unless you're willing to use force to physically stop them, it's very hard. And because, remember, again, particularly since the South China Sea is not the most important element in our relationship with China, we need their help on North Korea, which is a much more serious security threat than the South China Sea, to the United States. And so we posture, we send ships, we send a carrier battle group. I think there's a carrier battle group hovering off in the northern part of the South China Sea again as we speak, hoping that will deter China through we're trying to intimidate them to thinking that maybe we will use force. I always think it's a bad idea to bluff when you're talking about these sort of things, but nonetheless, that's the kind of game we're in right now. And why don't I stop there, since I've gone on too long, and take your questions. Okay, I see. Yes, sir, and then I'll come over here. Okay. The question is, did the United States have any military people on any of these islands? In other words, to put the pressure on the Chinese to say, if you want to do that, you're going to have to kill an American. And the answer is no. And the reason we don't, of course, is because of our policy position of we take no position on whose sovereignty claim is better. If we start occupying those features, we're taking a position. We're saying we think the Philippines' claim is better. So would it come to that, for example, in Scarborough Shoal, which probably does belong to the Philippines, legally? I mean, would it come to that? Don't know. It's hard to say. I don't think so. But the short answer to your question is no, and I don't anticipate it happening. The question was, has there been any Chinese use of force against the Vietnamese or the Filipinos and what have you? The answer is yes, but not for a long time. The last use of force was 1988, when the Chinese killed about 88 Vietnamese sailors and Marines on one of the islands that they took, Johnson Reef. There was a skirmish there, and it's one of those things you can actually Google it and see it on a YouTube broadcast. But it's pretty candid. They just machine gunned them, get these guys standing up to their knees in water as the hot tide was coming in, and blew them away, sunk a bunch of Vietnamese ships. But since that time, they have not shot at anybody. They've used the Coast Guard and what they call their maritime militia, which are empowered fishermen, to essentially shoulder, intimidate, use water cannons and those things, but they haven't rammed the ships, but they haven't taken any lives. Yes, sir, behind there. Then I'll get you here. Question is, what about the Japanese and the Australians, our two of our allies in Asia, and aren't they worried about what's going on in the South China Sea, and is this an indication of future Chinese behavior that could have a direct impact on them? And the answer is yes, they're very concerned. There has been talk in both countries about they too should participate in freedom of navigation operations. So far that has not happened. The Australians did one. I'm not sure they intended it, but they flew an airplane over one of the Chinese-occupied Spratlys, and they had a radio exchange. But I don't believe it was intended as a freedom of navigation operation. The Japanese have been talking about it, but the answer is yes, they're very concerned. And a lot of countries, not just the Japanese and the Australians, but most of the countries that live in the shadow of China are seeing the South China Sea as kind of a litmus test of future Chinese behavior. Are they going to throw their weight around when, quote, they're fully risen? Is this the way they're going to treat us? You're a small country and I'm a big country, and therefore you should be attentive to my interests. And so there's a lot of worry about that. Does Russia have any interest in the South China Sea? And if they do, what is it? The answer is not much, but if they do, it's essentially associated with commerce that would be coming to the Russian Far East and being able to go that way. I think the Russian, over time, are counting on the Arctic route, so they don't have to worry about the South China Sea. But because Russia and China are strategic partners, in cahoots, yes, that's right. Strategic partners, they are silent, have been silent on things that they might otherwise show some concern about in terms, because the Russians, the Soviets before them, were just as assiduous about following the rules of international behavior at sea as the U.S. was, or almost as assiduous. The Russians, like the Chinese, believe that national interest can always trump international law. But slight, I think. Yes, yes, ma'am. The law of the sea, were the Chinese involved in the drafting process? And the answer is yes, they were. They were, as were we, deeply involved, as were all of virtually most of the countries in the world. It was, in fact, many people think it's one of the great, probably the most significant multinational treaty ever created.
What date is that?
I'm sorry?
What date was that?
Well, it was finally came into force in '92. And when President Clinton sent the package to the Senate for ratification, and included all of the reservations that we took. The United States has taken reservations, just like China has, saying we're not going to be bound necessarily by international arbitration. And the Senate refused to ratify it, and they have refused to ratify it to this day. But to the point, yes, China was involved. They were involved in all the dialogue and all the debates, and they signed on, ratified it, and came into full compliance in 1992. Question is, if we're not taking a position on sovereignty, why is the rebalance in plussing up or increasing the amount of naval and air forces and military forces in Asia? They're separate but related. The ships in posture in the South China Sea are done with two objectives in mind. One, hopefully intimidate the Chinese not to go too far, and that's worked. And two, reassure our allies that we're not being cowed by the Chinese and are abandoning them. Within the broader context of the rebalance, the initial argument was that through the wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, our military posture globally became unbalanced. And too much of our military capability was invested in the Middle East to the neglect of East Asia, which the Obama administration sees as Asia is the economic center of gravity for the 21st century, and we think it's important that America be engaged. So as part, and when he announced this, for example, in Canberra, in a speech he made in Canberra, the point he made was, we need to be engaged because I want to create American jobs. If all the money is going to be in Asia, we want to sell American stuff to rich Asians. So, I mean, I'm using a shorthand there, but that truly is the motivation behind the notion of the rebalance. And then the military piece of it was trying to restore some of the unbalance or misbalance that had taken place earlier. Now, it's gone a little bit further than that, but nonetheless, and quite frankly, it was to reassure the allies that we were going to be there if China tried to push them around. So that's the connection. Does it make any sense? You can argue. I mean, there's a lot of people who do argue this. A lot of Asians say, so where's the beef? Where's the rebalance? I don't see that many ships. So the question is, clearly some of the areas, the 200-mile economic zones overlap. So what do you do when there's, I think the implication is, what do you do when you have an overlapping EEZ? For example, the East China Sea is a classic case. It's not 400 miles wide. So if Japan and China, the EEZ is over. And the law of the sea has provisions that say, when that happens, the two countries where their exclusive economic zones overlap have to meet and reach an agreement on how to delimit, draw a line between whose EEZ is whose EEZ. So in some cases, that has been done and they draw it on the equidistant line. In other words, we'll split the difference. In the East China Sea, for example, China says our continental shelf goes almost all the way to the to the Ryukyu chain, to Okinawa, and that's where our EEZ is. And Japan, you only get a little bit of it. And the Japanese say, oh, not so fast. We need to split this right down the middle. And there has been no negotiation to reconcile that. The question about Lieutenant Commander Lin, who is a U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander who's flying in our reconnaissance, electronic reconnaissance airplanes out of Japan, was arrested for potentially for espionage. He was a native-born Taiwanese, Republic of China, not mainland China. He came to the United States as a young man, enlisted in the Navy, and then naturalized and went to Officer Candidate School, but based upon what job he had and what have you, he's been very successful. Don't know, but obviously we're going to continue to do those reconnaissance missions. What he may or may not have told the Chinese, I have not a clue. And I'm sure a lot of it is going to be very sensitive intelligence, and so we may never know the particulars, but when it goes to a court-martial, I'm sure some of the specifics will come out. For all I know, he may be found innocent, but he's at least being held in confinement until the court-martial. The question is, would refurbishment of Subic Bay or the Clark Field in the Philippines, the Air Force base there, Angeles City was the outside, would that be helpful to the redressing some of the imbalances in the balance of power? Well, the United States has just recently concluded something called the Extended Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, that is a 10-year agreement that gives the United States access to 10 Philippine military facilities. And they just announced 6 of those within the last month, none of which is either Subic or what used to be Clark Field. But for the past 4 or 5 years, the Navy's been using Subic Bay all the time, in and out. The key, to my mind, is the port's there and the Philippine-run shipyard's there, and that's all well and good. The key is QB Point Naval Air Station, where you could fly jets off of, right there on, literally looking at the South China Sea. So I suspect that the reason that the bases that have been approved right now is go slow. The Philippine public opinion is still very sensitive to U.S. military presence in the Philippines. And so I think this is very gradual, and the bases that are picked are in kind of remote areas. And the new president of the Philippines, there's going to be an election here in May. Since this is a presidential agreement in the Philippines, could easily change your mind and say, go home again. So stay tuned, I guess, is on those.
You know more than you did before.
Thank you all for some very good questions.
Well, this was awfully good of you. You took your time, and you've got an extraordinary wealth of understanding of this question. So, again, we thank you a lot.